So, welcome everyone to part three of the Bible as backstory. Really excited about this series, and I for one, am having a lot of fun with it. Um, I would like to call us all to order with the prayer that we've been using for this series. One of my personal favorite prayers in the prayer book. It happens to be the collect for the second to last week of the church year, proper 28. So the Lord be with you, and also with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, for ever and ever. Amen. Okay, so we have some people continuing to join us, I see, and we'll welcome them as they come. Again, this is part three of the Bible as backstory, and I'm really glad to see you all back again for more. Again, the background assumptions that we are using, the background definitions and assumptions that we're using for this series are as follows, and I do like to repeat these at the beginning of each session. The Christian Bible, what is it? It is a library of ancient writings collected for use, for corporate use, as the genetic or adopted backstory for a Christian's life of faith. And I'm going to put that in the chat so you can see it. And then there's also the question, well, what's a backstory then? And this is a backstory, a history or background for a character in a story. And as individual human beings, we have our own backstories. Another guiding assumption of this class is that there is no such thing as a biblical text free of interpretation. It's just a question of how, when, and through whom the interpretation is happening. It could be someone else's paraphrase, it could be a translation, but no matter what, it is being interpreted through your own cultural and personal backstory every single time that it is read, and in whatever place you happen to be in today. It also is going to be filtered through your emotional state today. That's another piece of the interpretation. So first I just want to check in because we took a long time with the flood last week, and I left you with a parting question, which was, how might the flood, the story of the flood, inform your own backstory as a human being? Do you have any perspectives on that? Did anyone have any thoughts on that afterward? Or thoughts on how the creation story might have something to say to your backstory or be a piece of who you are and what you believe?
Well, the two things I left with, and it's not so much my own story, but the idea that God could sort of be very disappointed in his initial creation and then wipe them all out except for, one semi-righteous person. And that this vindictiveness, it's sort of the theologic God that could kind of omnipotent that could just sort of say, oh, this is crap, I'll just take you off the earth. That, the theology that could certainly happen again if you believe the story. So it was kind of disturbing to me. And then at the end there, and I think several people pointed out, the kind of the sins of the fathers will come down through generations in terms of blood, blood debt.
Mm-hmm.
So things in the story I hadn't really realized in previous readings.
Of course, it's also important to remember that at the end, God repents of his action and says, I'll never do it again. But you could look at it as God saying, well, I'll never do it again by a flood. Right? Darren, you raised your hand.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I wasn't here last week, but instantly, as you asked that question, it like set off in my head. Then, I was raised Baptist, and the Noah story was key in all the formation classes for the kids. And I noticed that like it had this ongoing effect for me of like really, really pushing procreative sex.
Really?
Because even as a very young kid, like I recognized, oh, the only reason these animals are here is on this boat is so that they can have sex with each other. and it was reductionist and vulgar. and in terms of like, that became the human role too. That's all we're here for. Just make babies. And I think that leaves a lot of people out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Which, of course, could take you into a whole conversation about sexual ethics, and then later what Martin Luther had to say about procreation, and so on and so forth, and that would be another whole wonderful conversation. But it's interesting, the things about a story that stick with us, right? It's not going to be the same with everyone, and it'll totally depend on our own backstory. Yeah, that's right. One thing that I came away with, and this was a new thought for me on the flood, and this is just this fanciful idea, what if the whole point of the flood story is that it's a thought experiment? What if it is us as human beings wondering, what if God got fed up with us? What if God decided to wipe us all out because God was sick of us? What would that look like? What would be the results of that? And then, of course, at the end of the story, it comes around to this incredible sense of hope with the rainbow and the promise not to destroy humans again. But it's a very human God we're talking about in that story. And that's probably a good segue into today. We're getting back now to the story of salvation history going chronologically, and this whole series will go chronologically. The problem is that we only have so many weeks, and we have to skip over an awful lot. So before we get to Abraham and Isaac today, I want to ask about, just touch on the well-known stories that we are skipping over right now, because they are not stories that are set aside to be read at the Great Vigil of Easter. So these are, we could call them second-tier stories, although in some cases these really aren't second-tier stories. They're just stories that didn't happen to get chosen for this set. I want to mention them, though. In between week 1 and week 2, we skipped over Cain and Abel. And you might be interested in knowing that the story of Cain killing Abel never comes up in the weekly lectionary of the Episcopal Church. We never read it on a Sunday. I think that's unconscionable. I think that story is way too important for us never to read on a Sunday, yet somehow it got left out. After the flood, we have the Tower of Babel. That story gets left out. Now I'm not talking left out of the lectionary. That does come up at some point. I mean, we're not going to talk about these stories in this series. God's multiple calls to Abram, who becomes Abraham. And it's multiple calls, remember, because we have more than one writer working on these stories. We especially have the J source and the P source, and often the P source answers the J source with different information. We have the establishment of circumcision, and we could call that the beginning of Judaism. That's pretty important. We skip over Abraham going to Egypt to hang out with Pharaoh and passing off Sarah as his sister, not once, but twice, on 2 different occasions. Why? Again, multiple authors in Genesis. We are skipping over Abraham's nephew Lot and his living in Sodom and Gomorrah, and God getting fed up with Sodom and Gomorrah and destroying them, and then the aftermath of that. By the way, the Sodom and Gomorrah story is not about homosexuality, and that's super clear if you just read it. All you have to do is read it. It's really, really clear. After that comes the whole saga with Hagar and Ishmael, where Abraham and Sarah lose faith that God will give them a son, and so Abraham fathers a son through his slave girl Hagar, and then Sarah gets sick of her and throws her out. And these are the legendary beginnings of Islam. If you look to Muslims, they would trace their lineage back to Hagar and Ishmael, and thus to Abraham.
Yeah, and a great TV series, The Handmaid's Tale, right?
I mean, I haven't read or watched The Handmaid's Tale, I have to confess right now, but
Yeah.
is there a connection to Hagar and Ishmael there?
Oh yeah, that's
Okay,
exactly the
okay.
deal. That there
All
was in a dystopian world in the future, the human beings, most of them become infertile, and so the rich people take on handmaidens with the permission of the wife in order to procreate.
Someday I will get to that book and or show. I know I must. It's so depressing. I don't want to do it. And then we skip Abraham and Sarah having 3 strange visitors from the desert who tell them that they're going to have a son. Those are all really important stories, but today we will wrestle with the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. And as we do so, the lens that I want to take today is to talk about the portrayal of emotions in the biblical narrative. This feels especially apt in this case, and I'll explain that in a moment. So tonight I thought that I would read the story. We will read it twice, but I'm going to read it the first time. And as you listen to this story, I want you to listen for a few things. First, listen for the words, "Here I am." And notice how many times those words come up. Here I am. In Hebrew, that's Hineni. And it comes up again and again and again, not just in this story, but throughout the Old Testament. As God calls to people, they respond, Hineni, which is literally, behold me. But we would certainly translate it as, here I am. In addition, listen in this story for cues about what emotions are being felt by the characters at any given time. See if you can discover that as you listen. So listen for here I am, count the times, and then also listen for cues about what emotions are being felt. And in order to benefit that, I'm going to try to use as little emotion as possible as I read this story. I'm going to leave it up to you. So here we are with Genesis 22, 1 through 18. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out, and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father, and he said, Here I am, my son. He said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So I tried to keep all the emotion out of my voice as I read that, and I did that for a purpose. I want to welcome Billy to the call and apologize to you, Billy. There was a mix-up with the links, and I'm glad you found the right one eventually. I'm glad you're here. So that's the story. Let me just ask real quickly, did you hear "Here I Am"? Somebody unmute and just say it.
I heard it 3 times.
3 times, 3 times. Yep, that's right. That's Hineni, "Here I Am." When I was in seminary, my Old Testament professor would take roll. She would want to know who was here at the beginning of every class period, so she would call our names, and we would have to say Hineni. So that's just an important word in the Old Testament, because it's not just Abraham. It shows up again and again. Now, emotions. What emotions were in this story? Did you hear any emotion words?
I don't think I did. It seemed emotionless to me.
Well, at the first part of it, there was love that was mentioned.
Very good.
But I didn't know if you meant emotions that we imagine somebody's feeling, or that was described in the verse.
Right, I didn't really specify. I was curious what you thought the emotional landscape of this story is, because it's remarkable how stark it is. No, it never says Abraham was agonized over this and didn't know what to do, right? It never says Abraham was excited and eager to do what God asked him to do. There's nothing like that. It's just this happened, and this happened, and this happened. But Jane, you're right. It does say at the beginning, God says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. That's in there. And I think that's really important. So
I think Isaac would have had emotion being tied up and put on an altar.
right?
I don't know how big the son is, but he can just be bound up and not protest.
Right. We have
he
no
can just willingly.
You're right. We have no reaction.
Lift him up there.
Yeah, we don't even have a vocal reaction from Isaac at that point. I mean, he asks in advance, where's the sacrifice? Terry?
Yeah, the one that got me was, what was Abraham feeling when Isaac asked him, where's the sacrifice? And then Abraham was basically lying. So it's just like, what emotions were there?
Right. What did Abraham say in response?
Lord will provide.
God will provide.
Right, God will provide. And I mean, you say he's lying, but that is kind of what turns out to happen, right? In the end.
Well, and it's sort of the analog to Jesus' emotion in the Garden of Gethsemane and his agony and the whole issue of whether Isaac should have, gone willingly, like Carol said. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we would think would provoke strong emotional responses about the whole story that's just kind of glossed over.
Yeah, Bill, hold that thought about Jesus in Gethsemane, because I'm not ready to leave the Hebrew world yet. Not quite. I mean, like the Hebrew world of the most ancient times. I'm not quite ready to go to Jesus yet, but I don't want to lose track of that either. So don't let this hour end before bringing that up, because I think you raise a very good point about a contrast in storytelling style and what exactly they're trying to get across. So what would be the impact on Abraham and Sarah, who's not in the story, of the death of Isaac at this point in the story? Meg?
Well, I think Abraham has so much faith. He says, we will worship and then we will come back to you, to the servants.
He says we.
We.
Right. Now, is he lying to the servants? Like he was lying to Isaac about the Lord providing? We don't really know because we don't have a window into Abraham's emotions, do we? He's kind of a blank slate. So you can project onto him what you want. You can project onto Abraham that he knew all along that God would never let him kill his son. That's why he said to the servants, we will come back to you, because he was sure. And that's why he said to Isaac, the Lord will provide, because he was sure. And even as the knife was about to come down, he was sure. Now, maybe that's your interpretation of the story. That's a viable interpretation, because we have no emotions here. Another viable interpretation would be that Abraham was solemnly resigned, and that he was lying to make his servants and his son feel better because he couldn't let the secret out about what he was about to do. We could believe that he felt deeply ashamed and that he could not believe that he was about to do this. He might have felt trapped, right? But we don't know because we don't have any emotional words to tell us in this story. It's really very incredible. Bill?
Well, you ask about the consequences too. It goes back to that previous story you told about Hagar and who would have really procreated the great nation. Isaac was his only son. He would have had to fall back on Hagar, and the whole genealogy of the great nations spawned by Abraham would have changed substantially.
Bingo. It's not just about their little family. I mean, you can certainly spend a lot of time dealing with the agony of a father who is about to kill his son for whatever reason. Or you can look at it from the grander perspective that all along there's been this build-up for 11 chapters in Genesis about God promising that Abraham and Sarah would have descendants as many as the stars in the sky and grains of sand on the seashore. And that the fathering a child through Hagar was a matter of losing faith, and then being told later, yes, you're going to have a son. That demonstrates to Abraham and Sarah that they had lost faith with the Hagar and Ishmael situation. So here comes the son. This is the child of promise. This is the one, the most important link to the future, and all of Judaism will exist because of this child. And then God says, kill him. And then at the end, God rewards him, or at least commends him, for demonstrating such faith. Now, are you okay with that? I'm not okay with that. I think that's horrible. That doesn't sound like the God I know. That's the God in this particular story. And there are many ways that God comes across in the Old Testament narrative. Terry.
Yeah, going through Abraham's whole emotional thought process there, the conflict that strikes me is one of a sense of guilt versus of the obligation of obedience.
Right. Okay, say more.
It would be a tremendously conflicting emotions, and I think if most of us reflect back our own spiritual journeys, we've probably had episodes like that where we feel like we're being obedient to God and doing the right thing, but something that is tweaking your conscience, maybe we're not doing the right thing.
Right. Maybe we're wrong about when we think we know what God wants from us. Maybe we were wrong about that.
But it doesn't feel right.
Right. And how could Abraham feel right about this? How could he be so sure that this is what God wants, that he would go as far as being about to bring the knife down? Do you think he hesitated? Do you think he held the knife in the air a little bit longer? It doesn't say.
Very human to do so.
Right. Mary?
I think when they went to worship, he went to talk God out of it. That would be mine. If he told me I had to kill my son, I would take him, I would show God how darling this person is, what a wonderful person he is, and how could he in any way possibly expect me to do that.
Right.
So it's kind of like when Christ asked that the cup be removed from him before the crucifixion.
Yeah. Yeah.
But no.
Yeah. It's interesting. That's another parallel to Gethsemane, and I find that fascinating. And we'll yeah. Terry.
I would question it, is this really the kind of God I really want to serve?
It's a fair question, right? Now, if it's the only God, if it's Yahweh, the one, the only, and Abraham really kind of marks the beginning of monotheism, then what other God is there? And how could you not? Darren, you have your hand up.
And it attaches to what you just said about.
And Darren, I'm sorry, but you are, Darren, you are really quiet. Maybe you could come closer to your mic.
I don't know. I think that might be as loud as I get.
Okay, fair enough. Go on.
Oh, well, so the thing I'm noticing is that this is kind of, can you hear me better?
No better. That's all right. Go ahead.
Well, the whole Abraham thing is about the start of a new religion in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of weirdness to this new religion. Genital mutilation, that first sacrifice where he cut all the animals in half and laid them out in order from biggest to smallest and then walks between them and they burst into fire. I mean, it's weird. And this, I think, is another part of like this astonishing weirdness of the religion. That like the patriarch is maybe psychotic. Or maybe even God. I don't know, but I think it's like it's just the beginning. This is still just the Genesis, and so the weirdness is just part of the process as it settles itself out. I don't know if that. I mean, like Abraham and Sarah are not likable.
Right, right, and in fact, when I was in when I was in
Hagar is disgusting. There's so much signs throughout the whole process that he's just another rich guy. He's loaded with land. He's loaded with servants and goods. And okay.
Yeah, Darren, when I was in seminary, I took a class on family systems theory, and we did a whole chart that showed all the dysfunction of the Abraham and Sarah family. We noticed all the places where relationship was broken, where people had done atrocious things. It just went on, and it made a lot of our own families look darn good by comparison. Matt.
Part of me wonders if Abraham could also have been testing God. Is this the God that I want to worship? Mm-hmm. Because in the chapter before, God said pretty bluntly, it's through Isaac that your descendants are going to be named. Mm-hmm. Sorry, just looked that up via Google.
Yeah, very good, very good. And there's no end to the possible ways that you could look at this story and the interpretations out there that have happened. If you want to ask the question, is it always right to do what you think God has asked of you and what you owe to God? Just go to the book of Judges and read about Jephthah. Jephthah is this general who goes off to war against his enemies, and he promises God in advance, if I triumph against my enemies, if you give me this victory, then I will sacrifice to you the first creature I see when I come home. And he wins the victory, and he comes straggling home from the battlefield victorious, and the first creature he sees is his own daughter running out to greet him with dancing and rejoicing. So what do you think he should do? What does he do? He sacrifices her. And over the last 2,000 years at least of Jewish rabbinic thought on this, Jephthah has not come out very favorably for that decision. So it's complicated, right? I mean, just because you think God God is telling you to do it. Maybe that's not always the best thing. So before we go any farther, I would love to have this story read a second time. And I would like to ask for somebody to read it who feels that they know the story well and can read well, and can insert some emotion into it. Now, I don't want overacting, right? But don't be boring like I was in my reading. I want someone who is confident to read this and can make the text come alive. So who can do that?
I'm always willing to read, you know that.
I know, KJ. And if no one else will, all right. Okay, KJ, you are on. And I will put it up on the screen for you to see.
Thank you.
Let's see. Pardon me a moment. I'm going to share my screen. Here you go. You're on mute, KJ.
There we go. Is that better? After these things, God tested Abram. He said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall now show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father, and he said, Here I am, my son. He said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided.
Actually, let's go ahead and stop right there, KJ. I'm sorry. I just want to move on because the rest of this is mostly recap. So let me ask you, can any of you identify, maybe interpret, what are some decisions that KJ, as the storyteller, had to make when reading this passage, when interpreting it for us, if you will? Yeah, Meg.
Well, Abraham is staying pretty calm through all this.
Apparently. Yeah. So what decisions did KJ have to make as he was reading? Yeah, Darren.
I noticed that KJ's reading made God sound a little more manipulative at the beginning,
Ah.
reminding reminding, take your only son, that one you love.
Right. Right. There's something about that cadence. Take your son Isaac, your only son, whom you love. It's like twisting the knife in, isn't it? Yeah. What else? Did you notice any other decisions KJ made? And if not, I'll ask KJ whether he made some decisions on the fly. All right, KJ, I'll turn it to you. What were the places where you had to decide how you were going to say that?
Well, honestly, that it's such a flat few verses that it's hard to put emotion in because there are no words. So and that's interesting that Darren pointed that out. Mm-hmm. I guess I do think that because I grew up as a literalist, a Bible literalist. So that story always freaked me out because there was no emotion. He was pure going to kill his son. So, but I tried to not put too much emotion in there actually, because there's hardly, I don't know, So it's a cold passage to me. It's cold.
Okay.
It's cold.
Well, and that's an interpretation, right? The choice to put very little emotion in is a choice to interpret in a certain way. The way I read it the first time, I think the interpretation of that was, this is a boring story. But KJ tried to read it genuinely, just without being overwrought, right? Now, if we really wanted to get into it, let me give an example here. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Well, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." Okay, so what did I do there?
You gave him the emotion of resolve, like sadness and resolve.
Right. Is that a fair interpretation? Right? When there's no emotion given in the text, I think we have a lot of room to play. And that means we have a lot of room to interpret. I think the Bible is made to be played with. It's not made to be something untouchable or something that we're afraid to mess with, right? I mean, the Jews have this long-standing tradition of midrash, where they would invent more stories to go alongside the story that would deepen the meaning and add more to it. Let me tell you a midrash story that I know, and this is about Abraham. It seems that when Abraham was a boy, this is not in the Bible, this is Jewish midrash written later. When Abraham was a boy, he worked for his father Terah in Terah's shop. And Terah's work was that he sold stone and wood and clay idols to people. And that was how they made their livelihood. Well, one day when Abraham was old enough, or Abram, I should say, he was still Abram at this point, he was put in charge of his father's idol shop for one day. And while his father was gone, Abram took a big stick and he destroyed all the idols in the entire store except for the biggest one. And then he took the stick and he put it in the hands of the biggest idol in the store. His father came back and said, "What has gone on here? Explain yourself." And Abram says, "I couldn't do anything. That idol just took a stick and destroyed all the other idols in the store." And Terah said, "What, are you kidding? They're made of stone and wood and clay. They can't do anything. They are useless." And Abram said, "Exactly." So that's not in the Bible, but it's a cherished Jewish story about the origins of Abram. And that story explains a lot more about what came to be the importance of Abram, that he was the beginning of monotheism, the idea that there are no other gods besides Yahweh. I just thought of that story. I wasn't going to share it tonight, but I'm glad I didn't forget it. So I've been asking each week for every story that we hear, as you listen, did anything surprise you or challenge your assumptions? Yeah, Terry.
Yeah, as far as the literalism, right when Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, it says that the voice of the angel of the Lord came down from heaven. But following that, it says that because you were obedient to me.
Ah, when it's the angel who's speaking.
Right.
Now this
I found that kind of curious.
And you know what? If you read this alongside other stories, like for instance, the three strangers coming out of the desert to announce to Abraham and Sarah that they're going to have a son, that story is downright weird in that sometimes there are three of them and sometimes only one of them is speaking. And sometimes you can't tell where that one is speaking from. Or let's compare to the story of Jacob, who finds himself wrestling with someone all night long until morning. Who is he wrestling with? What's your assumption? What have you always heard? Who have you always heard he was wrestling with?
Yeah.
With God or an angel?
An angel, yeah.
An angel? It probably depends on how you heard the story told when you were a child. But the text doesn't say either way. He just wrestles with a man, it says, until daybreak. So there's all sorts of weirdness like that in these ancient Hebrew stories where you're not quite sure who's in charge of the action here. But it sounds like this angel of the Lord, whoever this is to be equated with the Lord, right? At least that's how I read it. I don't think the angel of the Lord is to be worshipped in place of Yahweh. I say Yahweh, but we're not up to Yahweh yet, right? The word Yahweh is being used in the text, but only by the J writer. The P writer is withholding that name until later. Do you know why? I'll tell you. Because the P writer has more of the full scope of history. He's writing later. And he knows that when Moses was at the fire of the burning bush, that's when God said, I am that I am. And he identified himself as Yahweh. So when the P writer is writing, he doesn't give God that name until that point in the story, which comes after this. Before that, God is simply Elohim, which comes from an ancient word that basically means the gods. It's kind of plural and kind of not. It's hard to say. But you can kind of see the idea of Yahweh being filtered through the mists of time, through the ancientness, back from a time when people talked about the gods. Yahweh gets filtered through that to become the Yahweh whom we understand on the mountain with Moses.
Would the oral tradition be part of that?
Well, oral tradition is behind all of this written tradition. And what can we do but to say that and no more? Because we don't really know the whole contours of the oral tradition before this. Yeah, it all came from oral tradition. Bill?
Well, there's sort of a different perception I got too, that Elohim didn't say, I don't want sacrifices. It just sort of changed. I'll take blood sacrifices, the ram will do. And that sort of goes down through Jewish history to the whole temple sacrifices. Some people have said it was the biggest slaughterhouse of the ancient world, right?
So yeah, Bill, you're raising a very good point. What does this story say about sacrifice and about the practices of ritual sacrifice? One really great interpretation of the story, one of my favorites, is that this is an etiology. We talked about etiologies in the previous two classes, and etiology is a story that is made up to explain how something got to be the way it is, so that we have an explanation. There's a reason why childbirth is painful. Look at Adam and Eve, right? Well, what's the etiology of animal sacrifice? And what's the etiology of the fact that the Hebrews don't sacrifice human beings? Here it is, right? Other tribes in the area did. And when you hear about the god Molech, who and the people made their children go through fire to sacrifice to Molech, right? That's human sacrifice. And the Hebrews are saying, no, we don't do that. And here's our story about why we don't do that. And that makes us different from them. So that's another really great way to look at this story.
And for many, many years, parallel cultures as some kind of human sacrifice. I mean, that was one of the arguments with the Baals down through the ages, is they had the fertility sacrifices every year.
Yeah, just this week, and I didn't get enough information for this that I felt like I wanted to add a whole bunch to this material for this week, but I was listening to an episode of one of my favorite podcasts, which is called The Bible for Normal People. I want to recommend this podcast. I'm just going to type it in the box here. The Bible for Normal People with Pete Enns and Jared Bias. And these are a couple of evangelical Protestant Christians who have come to new scholarly understandings that has helped them grow beyond the faith of their childhood. I think it's probably something like how they would put it. Pete Enns recently came out with a great book called The Bible Tells Me So. I recommend that. In this particular episode of the podcast, they were talking about the origins of Yahweh, about how there came to be this concept of this one God Yahweh and how humans came to apprehend this. And the basic idea here was that Yahweh was kind of a mix of El and Baal, who were two well-known gods in Canaan at the time. And that the understanding over the centuries among the Hebrews came to be that there was only one God. And God was kind of like El in these ways. And God was kind of like Baal in these ways. But for whatever reason, by the time you get to the stories of Elijah and some of those later stories, Baal is seen as the big bad. Because maybe he's a little too similar to Yahweh. And we need to make sure that we differentiate. That's not what Yahweh is. So none of this is to say that there is truly a pantheon of gods and the Jews chose one, right? From the Jewish perspective, there was only ever one God. But what they're trying to do is show exactly who this God is and who this God isn't. And then at that point, one method to do that is to talk about different gods. But the most ancient Hebrew texts really have God as sort of the head of the pantheon of gods. And only over time, and into the later writers, do you get it filtered down into the notion of there being no other God but Yahweh. I could teach a couple terms real quick. The polytheism would be many gods, right? Monotheism would be belief in one God, but there's an in-between place, and that's called henotheism. And I'll put that in here too, in the text. And that is the idea that there are many gods, but there's only one who's really important, and there's only one who is to be honored. So that was sort of the in-between step that we see in a lot of the most ancient Hebrew writings. So we're starting to draw near the end of our time. I could go on and on about this. I want to share two more things with you before we go. One is just a personal story. That when I was in the 7th grade at church camp, so I guess I would have been about 11 or 12, they decided to publish a camp newspaper in the course of the week. And they took submissions from the kids. The kids were supposed to put in submissions for the camp newspaper, which they would lay out and photocopy for us in whatever way we did that in 1984 or whatever. And so I fancied myself a cartoonist in those years. So I thought, well, it's church camp. I'll submit a drawing that has to do with church camp, a cartoon. So, and I was also trying to be kind of a funny guy. So I drew a cartoon of Abraham standing with a knife. The knife is dripping blood, and the destroyed carcass of Isaac is lying in front of him with blood and guts everywhere. And from the clouds, a voice bubble comes down saying, Abraham, oh, too late. And they published it in the camp newspaper. And I just got to say, I'm really glad that nobody took me to task for that. You know what I mean? That they made room, because you know what I was doing? It was theological reflection. I was asking myself the question, what if? What if the story had gone a different way? What would have been the consequences? And in the 7th grade, the way that I knew how to do that was to draw a cartoon. It didn't make me an especially violent person. I was telling a lot of stories with blood and guts in those days. It didn't mean I was disturbed or troubled. It just meant that I was trying to work through the ramifications of the story, and that the story was thereby becoming important to me. So, just something to remember. The other thing I want to share is a poem that I came across a few years ago that I really, really love. Way back in about 2006, when I was working at St. Thomas Medina, we had decided that we would use the Abraham and Isaac story for the Easter Vigil. The musician at the time, Dent Davidson, some of you may know him. He's kind of a legend in our diocese. He was the musician at St. Thomas then, and it was up to him to come up with musical responses for all the readings at the Vigil. And he hated the Abraham and Isaac story. Just hated it, couldn't stand it, and could not come up with anything musical that would be fitting as a response. And he was complaining about this to me. So I said, well, Dent, I'm a composer. Why don't I write something? I want to write some sort of musical response for you for Abraham and Isaac. So I went on the web and I found a poem by a Jewish poet named Nan Cohen. And I will read you the poem. It's Abraham and Isaac. Part 1. He took him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to count them." And he added, "So shall your offspring be." I have lived in tents, and know how faint a trace we leave behind us on the earth. How when the body fails, the soul folds its light clothes and steals away. But now a child sleeps in my tent. I would raise a tower of stone to shield his head. And yet, the thought that any common stone must outlast him provokes such rage in me. I wake all night, alarmed and furious, seeing nothing in the dark but dark. Part 2. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. I have lived in tents, and often at midday have I parted the tent clothes and gone inside, with the light of day so blinding my eyes that my wife spoke to me out of darkness, saying, "Take this dish and eat." I have walked among the flocks on starless nights. With the blackness so filling my eyes, I put forth my hand, as if the night were a tent, as if some shape might glimmer in my sight before the cloths of night fell across it. Eyes full of light or dark, night or day, I cannot tell. I grope forward to lift the cloth of this moment and the next. I was so struck by that poem, and I set it for solo voice with piano accompaniment and sang it myself at the Vigil, and I've really treasured it ever since, and treasured this story ever since. I think that I think the lack of emotion in the text gives so many opportunities to explore the emotions that aren't in the text. So, any last minute thoughts on this? We still have 5 minutes, it turns out. Yeah, Elisa.
It really struck me that, Isaac said nothing while the sacrifice was, it was bound and, put on the altar. The lack of emotion there. I mean, I can't even imagine, not saying a word, not contributing anything to the story.
Right. And it's not like he hadn't spoken in the text before now. He had.
Right.
Yeah. I noticed that, well, let me ask you this. When you picture Isaac in this story, how old is he?
I picture him as like 13 or 10 or something, like a...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think I always have too. Any other takes on that?
Well, he's old enough to carry the wood himself, so I was thinking probably 12 to 14, 12 to 15.
Strong back, young man, 12 to 14.
And he's walking on his own. He's keeping up.
Right.
He's not like 4.
Right. What if he's like 30? Meg? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Meg.
Oh, I was just going to say the fact that Abraham could pick him up, wrap him up, pick him up, and put him in the altar. I've always thought, I don't think he could have been a grown man.
That's interesting too, isn't it? And yet, he doesn't seem to object. I'm pretty sure that there's a midrash. Don't quote me on this, and we're putting this on the internet. I think there's a midrash that suggests that Isaac was really the noble one here. That Abraham didn't want to do this when it came right down to it, and Isaac said, "No, you must, because this is what God wants." And so he proceeds. Yeah, Carol.
Did Sarah know anything about this? Were they going to come home and say, "Oh, where's Isaac?"
Right? Where is Sarah in all this? Does she when she sees them off, when she packs their lunch for them or whatever, does she have any idea what's going on? Right.
My guess is no, or once it happens.
Right. Darren, I see your hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's much better.
Good. Okay. So I noticed some parallels with the sacrifice of Jesus.
All right, let's come back around. Go on. Mm-hmm.
That it's somebody's son getting killed and the dad being kind of hesitant, but still kind of feeling that he's got to do it. There's 3 days are mentioned in the text. He has to carry his own wood to the sacrifice of himself. And so what's weird to me is that there's obvious parallels, but then I don't see the New Testament mentioning back those parallels.
You're absolutely right. That's fascinating. Now, any of the original Hebrew followers of Jesus probably would have thought of those. They probably didn't have to mention them because they would have known their stories so well. I had never thought about Isaac having to carry his own wood in that way. That's fascinating. That's absolutely wonderful. I was going to ask, I see a couple hands, but real quick, why does this story become one of the pivotal texts for the Great Vigil of Easter? Out of all the stories, and looking at all the ones we skipped, why this one? Mary? Are you unmuting, Mary?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
The stories are both about the death of their sons.
Right, like Darren said. Yeah.
Right, and you have a God. I mean, it's the same God, is it not, that was willing somehow or to have his own son die. And I mean, we have the foresight to see that now. But if I were Abraham and knew that about this God, I think, it would have added another layer of fear, I think, that he might actually ask him to kill his own son.
And then what happens to Jesus?
Right. That's what I'm saying.
I hear you now. Okay, right. That's the difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's sort of ironic, isn't it? That it's kind of like your cartoon. Well, I should have really just stopped with Isaac, right? And so he goes down 1,000 years and then kills his own son, right? I mean, it's really another weird parallel, right? Just what Mary was saying.
Darren.
Well, I think a key difference in these parallels that's interesting to consider is that Abraham and Isaac is from the perspective of the dad, and that painful process of killing your own son, whereas Jesus is from the perspective of the son being killed by the dad.
Right.
And so Jesus, gets to the point of despair and like, why are you forsaking me, and all that stuff.
And at the same time, although it is as yet undeveloped in the New Testament, if we're talking about a Trinity here, it's not just a father having a son killed. It is a God willingly going to his own death. And for me, the cross only works well from that perspective. When it's a father arranging for the death of his only son, I don't find much value in it, except when you start looking at the parallels with Abraham and Isaac. I mean, there are literary parallels, but from a theological perspective, I don't want a God who sacrifices a perfect son for all of us who don't deserve it, but a God who willingly offers his own life for me. That has value for me. And then that's another whole conversation. I would love to do a whole series on atonement theories. But we are out of time, and it's 8:02. And next week we will talk about Israel's deliverance at the Red Sea. And tonight, Billy Stockton has offered to lead us in Compline. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point.